Okay, class. So for the next lesson, we're going to drill down on one central aspect of Mill's utilitarianism, and that's his view of pleasure, right? We talked before about how the utility principle says that an action is right if it maximizes net pleasure. It's wrong if it does the reverse, if it brings about a net increase in pain. But one question is, what is the theory of pleasure or pain such that they're the only things you need to consider in ethics? And then we'll also look at an objection that this is somehow degrading and even not even ethical to consider only pleasure and pain. So this lesson will deal with the next three quotes on that Mill handout that I gave you. And it might seem to you that it seems like a good thing to maximize happiness and pleasure. And it seems like pain is a bad thing. I think we can all agree on that. And so minimizing net pain in the world, this also seems ethical. But that's not enough for Mill to get his point across, right? Because in order for the utility principle to capture all of ethics, he needs to be arguing that that's all that matters, right? That all that stuff that the ancient philosophers talked about in terms of ethics, the kinds of things that Kant talks about, dignity, those kinds of things, somehow, is that not important, or is that somehow wrapped up in the utility principle somehow? Mill needs to explain why it is that you only need to worry about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain in order to be ethical, right? And so he talks about this theory of life upon which utilitarianism rests. And what he means by a theory of life is he's essentially kind of setting out an understanding of values and why humans value things and what things humans value. And he wants to be able to argue that the only thing deep down that's valuable is pleasure. And the only thing that has negative value, the only thing that was really bad, is pain. So let's read the first quote there. He says, "Pleasure and the freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends." As we talked about before in this class, by ends we mean goals. So what Mill is saying is the only thing desirable as a goal is pleasure. And the only thing that is the opposite, the only thing we really want to avoid as a goal is pain, right? And then continuing the quote, he says, "And that all desirable things which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain." So let's try to unpack that language, understand what Mill is arguing for here, right? If we say that pleasure is the only goal, right, I think it leaves a lot of people scratching their heads and wondering, well, wait a minute, if pleasure is the only goal, right, if the only good thing in life is pleasure, the only bad thing is pain, right, then, for example, why am I trying so hard in school, right? Why am I working so hard? Why am I listening to my ethics professor yammer on and on about ethical theories when I could be drinking beer, right, or sleeping or something? Other of you will be wondering, wait a minute, yeah, I like drinking beer and sleeping and pleasurable things, but I also value my education. I value the enlightenment I get, the examined life that say the study of philosophy allows. I value pursuing my educational goals, my career goals, etc. I'm not just in it for the pleasure, right? So how does it make sense for Mill to say the only thing that's valuable is pleasure? The line where he says, all desirable things which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, right? What Mill wants to say is, I agree with you. There's basically an infinite number of things that people value as goals. And utilitarianism doesn't deny that. It simply says that behind each one of those goals is pleasure and the absence of pain. The reason why you value everything else you value in life is because of pleasure and pain. Either immediately, right, and this is either for the pleasure inherent in themselves, right, or eventually, or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. So Mill would say, look, that's great that you value not only drinking beer and sleeping, but that you're working hard in school and you're trying to learn this philosophy so that you can live an examined life. But Mill would say, why do you want to live an examined life? Probably because you don't want to end up being one of those people who, because you did not examine your life, because you didn't set wise goals for yourself, have reached a point where now you've pursued unwise goals that have not made you happy, and now you're miserable in a state of inner anguish, right? Or why is it that you are pursuing your career goals, right? Sure, you want to get that job, that career, etc., but why do you want those things? Mill would say, behind it all is your desire to have a more pleasant life or to avoid a life of pain, right? You want a good job such that you're not unemployed and starving, or you want a good job such that you can afford to buy the things that make you happy, or that you could afford, say, to have a family. But what's the value of the family? The value of the family is the pleasure, the enjoyment that it brings to you. So behind every other goal you might have in life, Mill thinks, if you examine it carefully, you'll see that either what you're looking for is the pleasure that brings you, right? So, as you're reading your philosophy, as you're listening to me talk about philosophy, perhaps you're feeling a sense of pleasure, but perhaps not, right? Perhaps this is utterly tedious and painful for you. I hope not. But if that's the case, even so, Mill would say, okay, so it's painful for you now, but why are you doing it then? Right? It must be that at the end of the line, if we see why you're doing it, what you want out of it, what that eventual goal is, we see behind that is the pleasure that eventually brings you, or the prevention of pain that eventually brings you, right? So Mill thinks, yeah, there are an infinite number of things that people pursue in life, but behind it all is pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay, so this is the theory of life upon which utilitarianism rests. The idea that the only thing valuable as a goal is pleasure and the absence of pain. He immediately responds to an objection, right? And I'll read what he says. He says, now such a theory of life excites in many minds, and among them some of the most estimable in feeling and purpose, inveterate dislike, right? So he says, when you talk about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, you have some people, including really brilliant, wonderful, good people, who just hate this idea and object to it strongly, right? And he said, continuing the quote, he says, to suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler object of desire and pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, a doctrine worthy only of swine. Right? So he's saying there's some really brilliant, really good people out there who, if you say that the only good thing in life is pleasure in the absence of pain, they're going to say, look, that is mean, lowly, degrading, groveling, right? And in fact, this is a doctrine worthy only of animals, like swine, right? Now, hopefully this is ringing a bell because we've actually seen this exact objection before in Aristotle. If you remember, when Aristotle looks at the life of enjoyment, that life in which pleasure and enjoyment is your highest goal, Aristotle dismisses it off the bat by saying, yeah, this is what lowly people pursue. And he says it's utterly degrading and slavish. Why? Because he says this is worthy only of cattle, right? This is the kind of life that animals, the cattle, or in this case, swine pursue, right? Animals, Aristotle thinks, do not have the kind of higher capacities that we have, and therefore it's fine for them to simply pursue pleasure and the avoidance of pain. But because we have these higher capacities, because we can think and reason and interact politically, right, and because we can pursue the eternal truths of the universe, a life where we live a life like an animal just pursuing pleasure is undignified, degrading, and clearly not the highest way of life. This is Aristotle's objection. And really, Aristotle there is voicing one of the most kind of commonly held objections to this whole point of view. There was a philosophy in Aristotle's time, another group of thinkers who modeled themselves off Socrates, the Epicureans. And Epicurus and the Epicureans also taught that the only thing valuable is pleasure and the only bad thing is pain. And in part, Aristotle is responding to them, as well as what he considers to be this commonly held view by the masses that pleasure is the only good thing. Right? But this becomes a kind of standard argument throughout the history of Western philosophy against the pursuit of pleasure, that it is degrading, worthy only of animals. I also want to bring in Kant here, because one of the people that Mill surely has in mind as a rival theory is Kant. Mill had read Kant very carefully, sometimes objects to him by name. And if you remember, for Kant, he was very wary of your desires and inclinations, everything having to do with the body as degrading, right? And behind that was also the worry about self-interest, right? If you say the only thing that's valuable in life is pleasure and pain, it seems like each one of us is then locked into self-interest, and we're only pursuing our own self-interest. I just want pleasure and avoidance of pain, right? And Kant thought that is utterly degrading and contrary to ethics. Ethics should instead be the kind of thing that calls upon us to be noble, lofty creatures who concern themselves with doing the good just because it's the good thing to do, not because we want some sort of reward, pleasure, or we're worried about some sort of punishment, some sort of pain, right? And so there's not only a worry about this being kind of degrading and animalistic, but there's also a worry about this being self-centered, right? Because it seems like the pursuit of pleasure is inherently a matter of self-interest. Okay? So that's the objection. Now let's see how Mill attempts to reply to it. And before I get into his exact wording, one of the things I want to say in terms of talking about self-interest, Kant was very wary of self-interest, and we talked about how that is a long-standing worry, the idea that people pursuing their self-interest, especially pursuing their desires and inclinations, is somehow unethical. It's the root of all ethical wrongdoing, chaos in society, etc. But one important thing to bear in mind when we see how Mill responds to it is that he is part of a tradition known as the Scottish Enlightenment that includes Adam Smith. Adam Smith is one of the main figures of this, along with, if you remember, we mentioned David Hume. David Hume is the philosopher that Kant read, and it woke him from his dogmatic slumber. As you probably know, Adam Smith is the father of economics as a quantitative field overall, and specifically of the idea of laissez-faire capitalism, the kind of capitalism that, in one form or another, most societies today have. And one of the things that Adam Smith tried to argue rationally and prove quantitatively is that if you have a society where each person is pursuing their own individual self-interest, the net quality of life will increase. Right? If I'm just, say I'm a baker and I'm just trying to make money as a baker, okay, that's true, but that will motivate me to make higher quality bread in a more efficient way such that I can make more money. What's the result of that? I pursue my own self-interest, but look, now there's more bread available for people, right? And so too with each other worker out there. Each one of us, by pursuing our own self-interest, actually benefits the whole. This is Adam Smith economics, right? And so Mill is part of this whole tradition. And in fact, Jeremy Bentham wrote an open letter to Adam Smith. They corresponded. They're very much in line with this idea of free market economies. And so this is in part what's in the background of Mill's mind. He has no problem with self-interest per se. He does not buy into what he would take to be a moralistic, confused idea that people should be selfless, right? He does require, if you remember that quote from before, he does require that you consider your happiness no greater than anybody else's happiness, right? You're not allowed in performing the utility calculus to weight your happiness as something that's more important than others. But on the other hand, there is no requirement that you be selfless, right? That you give up all self-interest, right? In order to be a good person, as there was in Kant, okay? And in fact, Mill argues that for the most part, the way that each one of us can most maximize net happiness is to pursue our own happiness. Right? Each one of us pursuing our own happiness is going to lift the net amount of happiness up. Right? Okay, so now let's look at the wording of how Mill responds to this objection. Talking of these people who are objecting, he says, it is not they, but their accusers. Right? So he says it's not the utilitarians, but the people who levy this objection who represent human beings in a degraded light, since the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. So what Mill really wants to do is flip this objection around and say, no, it's not the utilitarians that are presenting a degraded view of human life. No, it's the people presenting this objection. Why? Because they're assuming that when we talk about maximizing pleasure, we mean maximizing the kinds of pleasures that swine and other animals might have. But Mill says that's a degraded view of human life, because that's not the only kind of pleasure that human beings want or pursue. Right? And so he wants to say, look, we are not trying to just maximize these kind of lowly pleasures. Right? There's higher pleasures that human beings also pursue. And so what Mill wants to do is introduce this distinction between what he later calls higher pleasures and lower pleasures. And roughly what that maps onto is the higher pleasures for him are cultural or intellectual pleasures. The pleasure of reading philosophy and living an enlightened life. The pleasure of listening to music. The pleasure of reading literature, right? By lower pleasures, he means things like bodily pleasures, right? Drinking, sleeping, having sex, those kinds of things, right? He's not opposed to the lower pleasures, but the point is that when we say maximizing pleasure, we include especially those higher pleasures, right? So let's continue with the quote. He says, if this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsaid. So he says, look, if it's true that human beings are capable of no other pleasures than swine, okay, then the objection holds. But then again, what are you objecting to, right? Because it's not degrading for human beings to only pursue the kind of desires and pleasures that swine have, right? If that's all we're capable of, right? But his stronger objection is in that next line where he says, he's making this parallel between the kinds of things Epicureans were accused of and the kinds of things utilitarians are now accused of, since both of them want to base their view of life on pleasure. So he says, the comparison of the utilitarian or Epicurean life to that of beasts is felt as degrading precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conception of happiness. So he says, look, the reason why it seems degrading to say that you're seeking pleasure and that it's no better than swine is because you're thinking that all that means is people pursuing swine-like pleasures, right? This is the pleasure, say, of food, drinking, or things like that, right? But he says, human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. So Mill says, it's a fact that human beings are capable of higher sorts of pleasures than animals are, right? And so, yes, it would be degrading for a human being to live their life just, say, trying to drink and sleep and have sex, right, the way that an animal might, right? But no human being would find satisfaction in it. That's not really what happiness or true pleasure is. Mill thinks because we have these higher faculties, exactly as Aristotle says, we also have higher pleasures. So Mill would say, look at Aristotle's, say, contemplative life, right? Mill would say that's exactly right. This is a noble life pursuing the eternal truths of the universe. But Mill would say, why do you pursue those? It's either because of the pleasure inherent in learning those truths, or it's because armed with those truths, you hope later on to live a more pleasurable life or avoid pain, right? And so Mill's reply to the objection is simply to say, once we understand that by maximizing pleasure, we mean maximizing these higher pleasures, then there's nothing degrading, because the idea that we will only pursue lower pleasures is itself the degraded view of human life. But utilitarians think that if we're maximizing pleasure, we're going to be doing things like maximizing education, maximizing culture, right? Maximizing those kinds of things that we pride ourselves on as human beings, right? Because those are the kinds of things that hold real satisfaction for us, right? So he would say, for example, utilitarians, if they say that we're looking to maximize pleasure, that doesn't mean that everybody should go, spend all day in the pub, right? That doesn't mean that it would justify everybody being on a morphine drip, where we just kind of sit there and have a kind of, chemical pleasure pumped into our veins, right? Because that's not really happiness, right? That person who spends their whole life drinking in a pub, that person on a morphine drip, Mill says that's not true happiness. That's not the highest kind of pleasure that human beings can have, right? Those ways of life do not maximize pleasure. What does maximize pleasure? Being educated, right? Having a deep sense of culture, right? Having a deep sense of connection with other people, helping other people, all these kinds of things, Mill says, all these things we take to be noble are noble, and they have a different kind of pleasure to them. And so when we talk about maximizing pleasure, we're also looking to promote all of those things. Okay, so this is his objection. So now I want you to reflect on that objection and its reply. And the first thing I want you to reflect on is, do you agree with Mill that the only thing deep down that's valuable, that we desire as a goal, is pleasure and the absence of pain? Is he correct in that theory of life? And then my second part of the reflection, I want you to think about the solution that he offers, talking about higher and lower pleasures, right? And do you agree with him that there are higher and lower pleasures, and that therefore maximizing net pleasure would necessarily mean maximizing those higher pleasures, those intellectual and cultural pleasures?